The text message arrived at 2:47 a.m., jarring me awake from the kind of deep sleep that only comes after a 16-hour shift at the diner. My phone's harsh blue light cut through the darkness of my studio apartment, illuminating the water stain on the ceiling that I'd been meaning to report to my landlord for months. The message was from my eldest daughter, Victoria, and it contained a screenshot that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was a photo from her engagement party the night before, the one I hadn't been invited to. There she stood in a champagne-colored gown that probably cost more than I made in 3 months, surrounded by her fiancé's wealthy family in what looked like a mansion's grand ballroom. But it wasn't the opulence that cut me to the bone. It was the caption she'd written above it. "Thank God Marcus's family has money, because mine is laughably poor. My mom works at a greasy spoon and lives in a shoebox. At least our kids won't inherit that embarrassment." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stared at those words until they blurred together, my hands trembling as I read them again and again. Laughably poor. The phrase echoed in my mind like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. After everything I'd sacrificed, every dream I'd buried, every luxury I'd denied myself to give them the best life possible, this was how my own daughter saw me. As something embarrassing to be hidden away. Setting my phone down with hands that shook more than they should have for a woman of 55, I walked to the small window of my apartment and looked out at the city that never seemed to sleep. The neon lights of the all-night laundromat across the street cast pink and blue shadows across my face, and for a moment I caught my reflection in the glass. Gray roots showing through month-old box dye, lines etched deep around my eyes from years of double shifts and financial stress, wearing a faded nightgown that had seen better decades. To anyone looking, I probably did appear exactly as Victoria had described me. But appearances, as I'd learned long ago, could be devastatingly deceiving. My name is Elena Vasquez, and for the past 18 years I had been living the most elaborate lie of my life. Not the kind of lie that hurts people, but the kind that was supposed to protect them. The kind that was meant to teach my children the value of hard work, humility, and character. The kind that had backfired so spectacularly that my own flesh and blood now viewed me as a source of shame. I walked to my tiny kitchen and put the kettle on, needing something warm to chase away the chill that Victoria's words had left in my bones. While I waited for the water to boil, I found myself staring at the one photograph I kept on my refrigerator, a picture of my 3 children from 5 years ago at Christmas. Victoria, 28 now, and apparently engaged to someone whose family's money she valued more than her mother's love. My middle child, Sebastian, 26, and working as a financial advisor who seemed to have forgotten that his mother's advice had once mattered to him. And my youngest, Isabella, 24, and fresh out of graduate school, who'd been sending me increasingly infrequent texts as her social circle expanded into circles I apparently wasn't worthy to enter. The kettle's whistle pierced the quiet of my apartment, and I poured the steaming water over a tea bag that would have to last me 3 more cups before I could justify opening another box. As I sat at my second-hand kitchen table, holding the chipped mug between my hands, I thought about the conversation that had started this entire charade nearly 2 decades ago. It was 2006, and I had just turned 37. My husband Carlos had been gone for 3 years, taken by a construction accident that left me a widow with 3 young children, and a grief so profound I sometimes forgot to breathe. But what Carlos had also left me was something my children never knew about: a fortune that had been carefully built and strategically hidden across multiple offshore accounts. Carlos hadn't been just a construction worker, though that's what everyone in our neighborhood believed. He'd been a brilliant investor who'd started with a small inheritance from his grandmother and turned it into millions through careful cryptocurrency investments, real estate ventures, and technology stocks that no one else saw coming. He'd been particularly prescient about companies that would later become household names, buying shares when they were worth pennies and watching them multiply exponentially. But Carlos had also been a man who'd grown up poor, who remembered what it felt like to be hungry, to have his lights turned off, to wear shoes with holes, until they literally fell apart. He'd made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I would raise our children to understand struggle, to appreciate what they had, and to never take wealth for granted. "Elena," He'd said to me just months before his accident, when he'd sensed something I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Promise me that our children won't grow up entitled. Promise me they'll know what it means to work for something, to value a dollar, to treat everyone with respect regardless of what's in their bank account. I'd promised him, thinking it was a hypothetical conversation, the kind couples have when they're planning for a future they're sure they'll have time to figure out together. I never imagined I'd be making that promise real while grieving his loss and trying to hold our family together. The plan had seemed so clear back then. I would live modestly, work regular jobs, and let my children believe we were struggling financially. They would learn the value of hard work, develop empathy for others, and grow into grounded, humble adults who would appreciate everything they eventually inherited. The offshore accounts would remain untouched, growing quietly while I taught them lessons that money couldn't buy. What I hadn't anticipated was how completely my children would internalize the shame of our supposed poverty. How they would begin to see our circumstances not as temporary challenges to overcome, but as permanent markers of their mother's failure. How they would start to distance themselves from me as they climbed social and professional ladders, viewing me as dead weight that might drag them back down. The signs had been there for years, but I'd made excuses for each one. When Victoria was in high school and stopped bringing friends home, I told myself she was just becoming more independent. When Sebastian started working summer jobs at 14 and spent all his money on designer clothes, I thought he was developing a strong work ethic. When Isabella began lying about where she lived during college, giving her dorm address instead of our apartment, I convinced myself she was just trying to fit in. But the truth was darker and more painful than I'd wanted to acknowledge. My children had learned to be ashamed of me. They'd absorbed the message that poverty was a moral failing rather than a circumstance. And they'd decided that having a poor mother was something to overcome rather than something that had shaped their character. Victoria's engagement party, the one she hadn't invited me to, wasn't the first family event I'd been excluded from. Sebastian's promotion celebration at his firm last year had happened without me. Isabella's graduate school graduation had been too small for family, she'd claimed, though I'd later seen photos on social media of her with her father's side of the family, whom she'd somehow tracked down and reconnected with, despite them having been largely absent from her childhood. One by one, my children had edited me out of their success stories. I'd become the unfortunate backstory they were all working to overcome, the evidence of humble beginnings they'd rather not acknowledge now that they were building lives among people who'd never known struggle. The cruel irony was that their determination.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
To escape poverty had made them everything Carlos and I had hoped to protect them from becoming. They were materialistic, status-conscious, and willing to trade family loyalty for social advancement. They measured worth in dollars and designer labels, treating people differently based on perceived wealth and status. They had become exactly the kind of people we'd wanted to ensure they never turned into. As I sat in my small kitchen, reading Victoria's cruel words over and over, I realized that my grand experiment in character building had failed completely. Not only had my children not learned the lessons I'd hoped to teach them, but they'd learned the opposite lessons entirely. And worse, they'd learned to despise the person who'd sacrificed everything to try to teach them. The apartment around me suddenly felt suffocating. 18 years of careful budgeting, of choosing the cheapest options, of wearing secondhand clothes and working jobs that left my feet aching and my back screaming. 18 years of watching my children achieve success and then systematically excluding me from celebrating it with them. 18 years of being treated like an embarrassment by the people I loved most in the world. I thought about Carlos and what he would say if he could see how our plan had turned out. Would he be proud that our children had learned to work hard? Would he be satisfied that they understood the value of money? Or would he be as heartbroken as I was to see that they'd learned to value money more than family, success more than loyalty, appearance more than substance? My phone buzzed with another message, this one from Sebastian. "Mom, I saw Victoria's post. Maybe you should stay off social media for a while. You know how she gets when she's stressed about wedding planning." Even now, even when confronted with his sister's cruelty, Sebastian was making excuses for her while subtly suggesting that I was somehow the problem. That I should make myself even smaller, even more invisible, to accommodate their discomfort with my existence. But something had shifted inside me as I sat there in the pre-dawn darkness. The hurt was still there, sharp and fresh as an open wound, but underneath it was something else. Something I hadn't felt in 18 years. Anger. Not the quick flash of temper that comes and goes, but the slow-burning, determined anger that changes everything it touches. I was done being ashamed of who I was. Done accepting their shame of who I was. Done pretending that their success gave them the right to treat me like a burden. And I was especially done protecting them from the truth about what they were really inheriting when they talked about being embarrassed by their mother's poverty. Standing up from my kitchen table, I walked to the small closet in my bedroom and reached behind the hanging clothes to the shoebox I kept on the top shelf. Inside, underneath old photographs and birthday cards my children had made me when they still loved me unconditionally, was a leather portfolio I hadn't opened in 3 years. The documents inside told a story my children had never heard. Bank statements from institutions in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and Singapore. Investment portfolios that had grown exponentially over the past 18 years, compounding and multiplying while I lived on diner wages and food stamps. Real estate holdings in 3 countries that generated enough rental income each month to buy a luxury car. The numbers were staggering, even to me. What Carlos had left me had tripled in value, then tripled again. The cryptocurrency holdings alone were worth more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. The real estate investments had appreciated beyond our wildest projections. The technology stocks had split and split again, turning thousands into millions. According to the most recent statements, my net worth was somewhere north of $47 million. $47 million. While my children worried about me being an embarrassment to their social climbing aspirations. I sat on the edge of my bed, holding the portfolio in my lap, and began to laugh. It started as a quiet chuckle, but it grew louder and more uncontrolled, until I was laughing so hard that tears streamed down my face. The absurdity of it all, the cosmic joke of my situation, the sheer impossibility that my children thought they were protecting their reputations from their laughably poor mother. They had no idea what was coming. The laughter eventually subsided, leaving me feeling clearer than I had in years. 18 years of self-sacrifice and character building had accomplished nothing except teaching my children to despise their mother. 18 years of living beneath my means had only convinced them that I was incapable of living above them. It was time for the lesson to end. It was time for the truth to begin. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found a number I hadn't called in 3 years. Marcus Blackwood, Private Wealth Management, Geneva. Despite the early hour, I knew he would answer. When you're managing the kind of money I had hidden away, you make yourself available to your clients 24 hours a day. Elena. His familiar voice came through clearly despite the international connection. I was wondering when I might hear from you. Hello, Marcus. I think it's time. Time? Time to come home. There was a pause, then I could hear him pulling up files on his computer. Are you sure? It's been 18 years. That's a significant lifestyle change to make. I looked around my tiny apartment, at the water-stained ceiling, and the thrift store furniture, and the empty refrigerator that I'd been planning to fill when I got paid next week. Then I thought about Victoria's words, about Sebastian's excuses, about Isabella's lies about where she lived. I'm sure, I said. In fact, I want to accelerate things. I want to liquidate some of the cryptocurrency holdings. I want to activate the real estate portfolio. And Marcus, yes? I want to do this publicly. Very publicly. I could hear the smile in his voice. It will be my pleasure, Elena. How publicly are we talking? Let's just say that by the time I'm finished, everyone who matters to my children will know exactly how laughably poor their mother really is. After I hung up with Marcus, I made 2 more calls. The first was to my landlord, giving him 30 days notice on the apartment that had been my prison for nearly 2 decades. The second was to my manager at the diner, letting him know that my last shift would be Friday. Elena, honey? Margaret said, concern evident in her voice despite the early hour. You've been talking about quitting for years, but you never do it. What's different this time? This time, I said, Looking out at the city that was beginning to wake up around me, I remembered who I used to be. As the sun came up over the skyline, painting my small apartment in shades of gold and amber, I began planning the most expensive revenge in history. My children thought I was an embarrassment. They were about to learn what true embarrassment looked like. They thought I was laughably poor. They were about to discover that the only thing laughable was how wrong they'd been. And when the dust settled, when the truth was revealed and the consequences were real, maybe then they'd understand that the woman they'd been so ashamed of was the same woman who'd loved them enough to sacrifice her own identity for 18 years, trying to teach them lessons they'd refused to learn. But those lessons were over now. School was officially out, and it was time for the final exam. The next few weeks passed in a blur of international phone calls, legal documents, and financial maneuvers that would have impressed Carlos if he'd been alive to see them. Marcus worked with his usual efficiency, liquidating portions of my cryptocurrency portfolio at peak market values and transferring funds to more accessible accounts. The real estate portfolio was activated, with property managers in Monaco, Manhattan, and Malibu suddenly springing into action to prepare homes that had been empty for nearly 2 decades. But it was the smaller purchases that gave me the most satisfaction. The custom-tailored suits from Milan that fit my 55-year-old body like they'd been painted on. The shoes from Paris that cost more than I'd been spending on groceries in 6 months. The jewelry from Cartier that caught the light in ways that made passers-by stop and stare. Most importantly, I hired Catherine Mills, the most exclusive event planner in the city, to organize what I told her would be the most important party of my life. I want it to be unforgettable. I explained to Catherine as we sat in her downtown office, surrounded by photographs of weddings and galas that had graced the society pages. I want everyone who attends to remember this night for the rest of their lives. Catherine, a woman in her 40s with the kind of polished efficiency that comes from years of managing the whims of the ultra-wealthy, nodded as she took notes. What's the occasion? Let's call it a coming-out party. How many guests? About 200. I'll provide the list. Catherine looked up from her notepad. Mrs. Vasquez, if you don't mind me asking, what's your budget for this event? I smiled, remembering all the times I'd had to answer that question with embarrassment and apologies. Whatever it takes to make it perfect. The guest list was the most carefully curated document I'd ever created. Every name on it had significance. Victoria's fiancé Marcus and his family, who'd apparently been so concerned about marrying into a poor family. Sebastian's colleagues at the financial firm, who I was sure had heard stories about his struggling mother. Isabella's graduate school friends and professors, who probably pitied her for having to support her impoverished parent. But I didn't stop there. I invited the parents of my children's childhood friends, people who'd known us when Carlos was alive and who remembered a very different version of our family's circumstances. I invited Carlos's former business associates, men who'd watched him build a fortune, and who'd wondered what had happened to his widow and children. I invited the neighbors from our old house, the one we'd lived in before I deliberately downgraded our lifestyle to teach my children about struggle. Most importantly, I made sure that my children themselves would be there. Victoria was easy. I simply told her I wanted to host an engagement party for her, something small and intimate with just a few dozen of her closest friends. Sebastian and Isabella I lured with the promise of finally meeting some people who might be able to help with your careers. They all said yes, though I could hear the reluctance in their voices. Victoria made it clear that she expected me to keep the budget reasonable and not embarrass her in front of Marcus's family. Sebastian asked if I needed him to contribute financially, his tone suggesting he expected me to say yes. Isabella wanted to know if she could bring a friend, just in case things get awkward. The condescension in their voices was almost amusing now that I knew what was coming. They were attending their mother's party as a favor to her, a charity case who needed their presence to feel validated. They had no idea they were walking into the most expensive surprise of their lives. The venue Catherine secured was the Grand Ballroom of the Meridian Hotel, a space that usually hosted society weddings and corporate galas for Fortune 500 companies. The cost for a single evening was more than I'd pretended to make in a year, but seeing the space transformed according to my specifications was worth every penny. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in ivory silk and set with china that cost more per place setting than my monthly rent. Orchid centerpieces flown in from Thailand filled the air with subtle fragrance, while a string quartet played softly in one corner. It was elegant without being ostentatious, sophisticated without being intimidating. It was exactly the kind of party that Victoria had probably dreamed of having, but could never afford on her teacher's salary. At least, that's what she thought. The dress I chose for the evening was a masterpiece of understated elegance. Deep navy silk that skimmed my figure perfectly, with subtle beading that caught the light when I moved. My hair, which had been professionally colored and styled for the first time in 18 years, fell in soft waves past my shoulders. The jewelry was simple but unmistakably expensive. Pearl earrings and a matching necklace that had belonged to my grandmother, pieces I'd kept in a safety deposit box for 2 decades. When I looked in the mirror of my hotel suite as I prepared for the evening, I saw a woman I'd almost forgotten existed. Confident, elegant, comfortable in her own skin. The woman Carlos had fallen in love with, before grief and sacrifice had worn her down to shadows. But the most important accessory I wore that evening wasn't visible to anyone else. It was a small leather portfolio containing documents that would change everything my children thought they knew about their lives. Bank statements, investment portfolios, real estate holdings, and most importantly, the trust documents that Carlos and I had established before his death. Because there was one detail about our financial arrangements that I hadn't shared with Marcus, one secret that even my private wealth manager didn't know. The money wasn't just mine. According to the trust documents, my children were already inheritors of their father's fortune. They had been millionaires since the day they turned 21, they just didn't know it yet. They'd spent the last 7 to 9 years being ashamed of their poor mother, while sitting on trust funds that could have bought them anything they'd ever wanted. They'd worried about student loans while having access to accounts that generated more in monthly interest than most people made in salaries. They'd climbed social ladders and chased wealthy partners, while already possessing the kind of generational wealth that most people could only dream of. The irony was so perfect it was almost artistic. As my car pulled up to the hotel entrance, I could see guests already arriving. Victoria stood near the entrance in a dress that was pretty but obviously off the rack, greeting people with the slightly strained smile of someone who was worried about what the evening might cost her. Sebastian was checking his watch repeatedly, probably calculating how long he needed to stay before he could politely leave. Isabella was scrolling through her phone, already documenting the evening for social media with photos that carefully cropped out any indication of the venue's true elegance. They all looked up as I approached, and I watched their faces cycle through confusion, surprise, and something that might have been concern. They didn't recognize their mother in the woman walking toward them with quiet confidence, wearing a dress that cost more than their monthly salaries. "Mom?" Victoria's voice was uncertain. "You look different." "Thank you, sweetheart. You look beautiful." "Marcus, it's wonderful to finally meet you." I extended my hand to Victoria's fiancé, a pleasant-looking man in his early 30s, who was clearly trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with whatever Victoria had told him about her family's circumstances. "Mrs. Vasquez, thank you so much for hosting this. The venue is incredible. How did you manage to book the grand ballroom?" Victoria shot me a look that was part panic, part warning. I could see her calculating costs in her head, wondering how her poor mother had afforded an evening that was obviously beyond her means. "I have my ways," I said lightly. "Shall we go in? I think everyone's arrived." The next 2 hours were among the most entertaining of my life. I moved through the party like a woman who belonged there, which I did, accepting compliments on the venue and the food and the overall elegance of the evening. My children followed me at a distance, clearly confused by their mother's sudden transformation from embarrassing poor relation to sophisticated hostess. But it was the conversations with the other guests that were most revealing. Carlos's former business associates, men I hadn't seen in 18 years, greeted me with genuine warmth and curiosity about where I'd been and what I'd been doing. "Elena, my God, you look exactly the same," said David Chen, who'd been Carlos's partner in several of their most successful ventures. "We lost touch after Carlos passed. How have you been? How are the children?" "We've been well," I said carefully, taking some time to figure things out. And the investments Carlos left? I always wondered what happened with those. He was so far ahead of the curve on cryptocurrency and tech stocks. I glanced across the room to where Sebastian was standing with a group of his colleagues, probably explaining that his mother was having some kind of midlife crisis and spending money she didn't have. "Those investments have done very well," I said quietly. "Very well indeed." David's eyes widened slightly as he began to understand. "Elena, are you saying that you've been managing Carlos's portfolio all these years?" "Among other things. But your children, I heard they'd been struggling financially, working their way through school, taking out loans." "They were learning," I said simply, "though I'm beginning to think the lesson may have run its course." As the evening progressed, I could see my children becoming increasingly agitated. Victoria kept shooting me worried glances, probably calculating the cost of the evening and wondering how she was going to explain to Marcus's family that her mother had spent money she didn't have to impress them. Sebastian had cornered one of the waiters and was asking pointed questions about the venue's rates. Isabella was taking fewer photos, apparently realizing that documenting this level of luxury might raise questions about her family's financial situation. Finally, as dinner was being served, I decided it was time. I stood at the head table and tapped my champagne glass with a silver knife, the clear chime silencing the conversations around the room. 200 faces turned toward me, my children's among them, all waiting to hear what the evening's mysterious hostess had to say. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. Many of you knew my late husband Carlos, and you've watched our children grow up over the years. Tonight is special for many reasons, but mostly because it marks the end of a very long chapter in our family's story." I could see Victoria's face going pale, probably anticipating some kind of public breakdown or financial confession. 18 years ago, when Carlos died, I made a decision about how to raise our children. I wanted them to understand struggle, to appreciate hard work, to value character over wealth. So I chose to live modestly, to work regular jobs, and to let them believe that we were financially struggling. The room was completely silent now. Even the waiters had stopped moving. I wanted my children to grow up humble, grateful, and grounded. I wanted them to treat everyone with respect regardless of their circumstances. I wanted them to understand that a person's worth isn't measured by their bank account. Sebastian was staring at me with growing understanding and horror. Isabella had stopped breathing altogether. Tonight, I want to share with you all how successful that experiment was. I reached into my purse and pulled out the leather portfolio, setting it on the table in front of me. 3 days ago, my daughter Victoria posted on social media that she was grateful her fiancé Ed's family had money, because her own family was laughably poor. She said her mother worked at a greasy spoon and lived in a shoebox, and that our children wouldn't inherit that embarrassment. Victoria made a small sound that might have been a sob. "I thought you all might be interested to know exactly what my children will be inheriting from their laughably poor mother." I opened the portfolio and began reading from the financial statements Marcus had prepared. The offshore investment portfolio currently valued at $23.7 million. The real estate holdings in Monaco, Manhattan, and Malibu, worth approximately $12.4 million. The cryptocurrency investments, which have performed exceptionally well over the past 18 years, valued at $8.9 million. And various other assets, bringing the total to just over $47 million. The silence in the room was profound. I could hear someone drop their fork at a table near the back. "But that's not the most interesting part," I continued, looking directly at my 3 children, who were standing frozen near the bar like deer caught in headlights. "The most interesting part is that according to the trust documents their father and I established before his death, my children have each had access to their inheritance since they turned 21. Victoria swayed slightly, and Marcus reached out to steady her. "Sebastian has been sitting on a trust fund worth approximately $14 million for the past 5 years. Isabella has had access to $12 million for the past 3 years. Victoria has been a multimillionaire for 7 years." I closed the portfolio and looked around the room at the shocked faces staring back at me. They've spent all these years being ashamed of their poor mother, worrying about student loans and entry-level salaries, chasing wealthy partners and social advancement. never knowing that they already had more money than most of the people they were trying to impress. The silence stretched until finally David Chen started laughing, a rich, delighted sound that echoed through the ballroom. "Elena," he said, shaking his head in amazement. "That is the most elaborate trust fund surprise in history. Carlos would have loved this." "Actually," I said, smiling for the first time all evening. Carlos thought of it. The trust was his idea. He wanted to make sure our children learned the value of money before they inherited it. We just never imagined it would take quite this long for them to learn the lesson. I looked at my 3 children, who were standing together now, supporting each other as they processed what they'd just heard. "The question now," I said quietly, "is whether they've learned it at all." The aftermath of my revelation rippled through the ballroom like a stone thrown into still water. Conversations resumed in hushed whispers as guests tried to process what they'd just heard, while my 3 children remained frozen near the bar, their faces cycling through emotions I couldn't quite read from across the room. Victoria was the first to move, pushing through the crowd toward me with determined steps that reminded me of the little girl who used to charge into my bedroom on Christmas morning. But there was nothing childlike about the expression on her face now. It was pure adult fury mixed with something that looked like betrayal. "We need to talk," she said when she reached me, her voice low but trembling with barely controlled emotion. "Right now." "Of course, sweetheart," I replied calmly, though my heart was racing. This was the moment I'd been both anticipating and dreading for weeks. "Would you prefer somewhere private?" "Yes." The word came out sharp and final. I excused myself from David Chen, who was still chuckling and shaking his head in amazement, and followed Victoria toward the ballroom's private alcove. Sebastian and Isabella fell into step behind us, creating a small procession that drew curious glances from the other guests. Marcus started to follow, but Victoria held up a hand to stop him. "Family only," she said, and something in her tone made him step back without argument. The alcove was a small seating area, separated from the main ballroom by heavy velvet curtains. It had been designed for exactly this purpose: private conversations that needed to happen away from prying eyes. As soon as the curtains closed behind us, Victoria whirled to face me. "What the hell was that?" she demanded, her voice cracking on the last word. "That was the truth," I said simply, settling into one of the upholstered chairs. "Something I should have shared with you years ago. You let us think we were poor." Isabella's voice was higher than usual, the way it got when she was truly upset. "For years, Mom. Years! Do you know what that was like?" Sebastian, who had been silent since my announcement, finally spoke. "Do you know how many opportunities I passed up because I thought we couldn't afford them? How many times I worked overtime to send you money for groceries while you were sitting on millions of dollars?" The pain in his voice cut deeper than Victoria's anger. Sebastian had always been my most thoughtful child, the one who called every week to check on me, who sent me gift cards for the grocery store on my birthday because he worried I wasn't eating well enough. Learning that his concern had been unnecessary, that his sacrifices had been meaningless, must have felt like a cruel joke. "I know," I said quietly. "I know exactly what it cost all of you, and I'm sorry for that. But I need you to understand why I did it." "To teach us a lesson?" Victoria's laugh was bitter. "Well, congratulations, Mom. Lesson learned. We learned that our mother was a liar, who let us struggle for no reason." "You learned that struggle builds character," I replied, though even as I said it, I could hear how hollow the words sounded. "You learned to work hard, to value what you have, to treat people with respect regardless of their circumstances." "Did we?" Isabella challenged. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like we learned to be ashamed of where we came from. We learned to lie about our family to fit in with people who had more money. We learned that poverty was something embarrassing that needed to be hidden." Her words hit me like a physical blow because they were absolutely true. In trying to teach my children humility, I had inadvertently taught them shame. In trying to show them that money didn't define worth, I had created a situation where they defined their worth by their distance from our supposed poverty. "Your father wanted you to understand what it meant to work for something," I said, though the explanation felt weak even to me now. He grew up poor, really poor, and he never wanted you to take wealth for granted. So instead, you made us take poverty for granted, Sebastian said, his voice flat. You made us experts at being broke while we were secretly millionaires. Do you see how twisted that is? I looked at my 3 children, these adults I'd raised and loved, and apparently damaged in ways I was only beginning to understand. Victoria was pacing now, her engagement dress swishing with each agitated step. Isabella was perched on the edge of a chair, her hands clenched in her lap. Sebastian stood with his back against the wall, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. I thought I was protecting you, I said finally. I thought if you grew up knowing about the money, you'd become entitled, spoiled, the kind of people who look down on others. Instead, we became the kind of people who look down on ourselves. Victoria shot back. Do you know what I told Marcus about our family? Do you know the stories I made up to explain why my mother lived in a studio apartment and worked at a diner? I didn't want to know, but I could see she was going to tell me anyway. I told him you'd made some bad financial decisions after Dad died, that you'd trusted the wrong people with investments, and lost everything. I made you sound like a victim of circumstances rather than someone who was too lazy or stupid to improve her situation. Each word was like a knife. Even in her attempts to protect my reputation, Victoria had needed to create a narrative that explained away my apparent failure. She couldn't simply accept that her mother was poor. She had to find reasons that made it palatable. And me? Sebastian added, his voice thick with emotion. I told everyone at work that I was supporting my mother financially. I let them think I was this devoted son who sent money home every month. Do you know how that felt when they praised me for it? When they told me I was such a good man for taking care of my struggling parent? I never asked you to send me money, I said weakly. No, but you took it, Isabella pointed out. Every gift card, every cash birthday present, every time we insisted on paying for dinner. You took it and said thank you, while sitting on $47 million. The accusation hung in the air between us. She was right, of course. I had accepted their financial help, their concern, their pity, all while knowing it was completely unnecessary. At the time, I'd told myself it was part of the lesson, letting them experience the satisfaction of helping someone they loved. Now it just felt cruel. I was going to tell you, I said, though I knew how inadequate that sounded. When you were older, more mature, when I thought you'd learned the lessons your father wanted you to learn. When? Victoria demanded. When we were 30? 40? When we were old enough to realize we'd wasted our entire youth worrying about money that didn't exist? When you stopped being ashamed of me? I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. The silence that followed was profound. My children stared at me with expressions I couldn't read, processing this admission that I'd been watching them, judging them, waiting for them to prove themselves worthy of the truth. You knew, Isabella said slowly, you knew we were ashamed, and you just let us be. I hoped you'd grow out of it, I said. I hoped you'd realize that having a poor mother wasn't something to be embarrassed about, that my circumstances didn't reflect on your worth. But they weren't your circumstances, Sebastian said, his voice rising. That's the point, Mom. You weren't actually poor. You were rich pretending to be poor, which makes this whole thing even more messed up. He was right, and I was beginning to see the scope of my miscalculation. I had thought I was teaching my children to value substance over appearance. But I had actually been teaching them that appearance was so important that I was willing to live a lie for decades to maintain it. I need some air, Victoria said suddenly, pushing past me toward the curtains. I can't do this right now. Victoria, wait. No. She stopped and turned back to face me, and for the first time since she was a child, I could see tears in her eyes. Do you know what the worst part is? It's not the money. It's not even the lying. It's that you didn't trust us. You didn't trust us to handle the truth, to grow up decent despite having wealth, to love you regardless of your bank account. I was trying to protect you. You were trying to control us, she interrupted. You wanted to create the perfect children who would love you for all the right reasons, so you manipulated our entire reality to make it happen. And when we didn't turn out exactly the way you wanted, when we became human beings with complicated feelings about our circumstances, you decided we didn't deserve the truth. She pushed through the curtains and was gone, leaving me alone with Sebastian and Isabella. I could hear the murmur of conversation from the ballroom beyond, the clink of glasses and the soft notes of the string quartet. The party was continuing without us, while my family fell apart in a private alcove. "She's not wrong," Sebastian said quietly. "About the trust thing. You made decisions about our lives without including us, and then you judged us for how we reacted to those decisions." "I was grieving," I said, though I knew it wasn't an excuse for 18 years of deception. "Your father had just died. I was overwhelmed, and I thought I was doing what he would have wanted." "Dad's been gone for 18 years, Isabella pointed out. "At some point, this stopped being about what he wanted, and started being about what you wanted. And what you wanted was children who would love you unconditionally, even if it meant living a lie to get it." I looked at my youngest daughter, this brilliant young woman who had apparently inherited her father's ability to see straight to the heart of complicated situations. She was right, of course. Somewhere along the way, my tribute to Carlos's wishes had become my own experiment in social engineering. "I love you," I said, though the words felt inadequate. "Everything I did was because I love you." "I know," Isabella said, and her voice was infinitely sad, "but love isn't supposed to hurt this much." She stood and smoothed her dress, preparing to follow Victoria back to the party. "I need to think about this. We all do. This isn't the kind of thing you process in 10 minutes behind a curtain." "Isabella? Mom?" She stopped and looked back at me. "I'm glad you're not actually poor. I'm glad you haven't been struggling all these years. But I'm not glad you lied to us, and I'm not sure when I will be." Then she was gone too, leaving me alone with Sebastian, who was still leaning against the wall looking like he'd been hit by a truck. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked. "The party? A few weeks." "No, this. The revelation. The dramatic announcement. How long have you been planning to humiliate us in front of 200 people?" The word humiliate hit me hard because I realized that's exactly what I'd done. In my desire to make a dramatic point about their assumptions, I had embarrassed my children in front of everyone who mattered to them. I had done to them what Victoria had done to me with her social media post, only worse because I'd done it publicly and deliberately. "I didn't think of it as humiliation," I said. "I thought of it as revelation." "Same thing, when you're on the receiving end." Sebastian pushed off from the wall and walked to the window that looked out over the city. "Do you know what I'm going to have to face at work tomorrow? All my colleagues are here tonight. They just watched me find out that everything I've told them about my family was a lie. You can tell them the truth now." "The truth?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The truth is that I'm a 30-year-old financial advisor who didn't know his own family's financial situation. The truth is that I've been worried about my mother's retirement while she's richer than most of my clients. The truth is that I'm apparently too stupid or unobservant to notice that the woman I thought was struggling was actually choosing to live in poverty." "You're not stupid." "Then what am I?" "Because I feel pretty stupid right now." He turned back to face me. "I sent you money for groceries, Mom. I worried about your health insurance. I stayed up nights wondering if you were eating enough, if you were safe in that neighborhood, if you were too proud to ask for help when you needed it." The pain in his voice was unbearable. Of all my children, Sebastian had maintained the closest relationship with me throughout their adulthood. He called every week, visited every month, remembered my birthday and holidays with thoughtful gifts he could barely afford. He had been the one constant source of love and support in my life, and I had repaid him by making that love unnecessary. "I never wanted you to worry," I said, "but you let me anyway, for years. You let me carry that weight because it fit with your plan. It wasn't a plan to hurt you, but it did hurt me, and Isabella, and Victoria. We all carried the weight of thinking our mother was struggling while we were building our careers and our lives. We all felt guilty for having opportunities you didn't have, for moving forward while you stayed behind." His voice cracked. "And now I find out that you weren't behind at all. You were ahead. You were always ahead." I stood and walked toward him, wanting to offer comfort but not knowing how. "Sebastian, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I thought. You thought you knew better than we did about our own lives. He stepped back when I reached for him. You thought you could manipulate our reality and our emotions and our relationships to create some ideal outcome that existed only in your head. I thought I was being a good mother. You were being a controlling mother. There's a difference. The accusation stung because I could hear the truth in it. Somewhere in my grief and my desire to honor Carlos's memory, I had indeed become controlling. I had decided what my children should learn, how they should grow, what they should value, all without consulting them or considering what they might actually need. What can I do? I asked. How do I fix this? Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the city lights that sparkled below us. When he finally spoke, his voice was tired. I don't know if you can. This isn't the kind of thing you fix with an apology or an explanation. You fundamentally changed our understanding of reality, and you did it deliberately. That's going to take time to process. But we can work through it? As a family? Maybe. I hope so. But Mom. He looked directly at me for the first time since my announcement. It's going to be different now. Everything is different now. You can't unmake this choice. I know. Do you? Because I think you still believe that somewhere underneath all our anger and hurt, we're going to be grateful. I think you think that once we calm down and think about it, we'll realize you were right to do what you did. He was reading me too clearly, and I realized that part of me had indeed been expecting gratitude. Not immediately, perhaps, but eventually. I had imagined my children coming to understand that my deception had been motivated by love, that my lessons had ultimately been valuable, that they would thank me for teaching them character. We're not going to be grateful, Sebastian said quietly. We're going to be hurt and confused and angry for a very long time, and if you're waiting for us to tell you that you were right to lie to us for 18 years, you're going to be waiting forever. With that, he walked past me toward the curtains. I'm going to go find Victoria and Isabella. We need to figure out how to get through the rest of this evening without making things worse. Sebastian? He paused at the curtains. I love you. I've always loved you. That was never a lie. I know, he said, and his voice was infinitely sad, but right now that almost makes it harder. Then he was gone, and I was alone in the alcove with the sound of the party continuing beyond the curtains. I sat down heavily in one of the chairs and tried to process what had just happened. In less than 20 minutes, I had managed to destroy the relationships with all three of my children while revealing a truth I had thought would ultimately bring us closer together. My phone buzzed with a text message from Catherine, my event planner. Everything going well? The staff says dinner service is running smoothly. I looked at the message and almost laughed at the absurdity of it. The party was indeed running smoothly. The guests were enjoying the food and wine, the music was lovely, the venue was spectacular. By any objective measure, the evening was a complete success. By any personal measure, it was a disaster. I stood and smoothed my dress, preparing to return to the ballroom and play the role of gracious hostess for the remainder of the evening. My children would need time to process what they'd learned, and I would need to learn how to live with the consequences of my choices. But first, I needed to get through the next few hours, surrounded by 200 people who had just witnessed the most dramatic family revelation in recent memory. Some would be sympathetic, others would be curious, and still others would be quietly delighted by the spectacle of it all. I pushed through the curtains and stepped back into the warm light of the ballroom, where conversations paused slightly as people noticed my return. David Chen approached me immediately, his expression concerned. Elena, are you all right? That was quite an evening for revelations. It was time, I said simply. Past time, actually. And the children? How are they handling it? I looked across the room to where Victoria stood with Marcus, her face composed but her posture rigid. Sebastian and Isabella were near the bar, talking quietly with their heads close together like they used to do as children when they were planning something. They're processing, I said. It's a lot to take in. I imagine it is. You know, Carlos would have been proud of what you accomplished tonight. Not just the revelation, but the way you handled it. With dignity. I appreciated his kindness, but I wasn't sure dignity was the word I would use for what had just happened. Dramatic, perhaps, Necessary, maybe. But dignified felt like a generous interpretation of my decision to air my family's secrets in front of 200 guests. David, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think I was wrong to hide the money for so long? He considered the question seriously, which I appreciated. I think you were trying to solve a problem that didn't exist. Your children seem like good people. Hardworking, responsible, caring. I'm not sure they needed to be protected from wealth. But Carlos was so worried about entitlement. Carlos was worried about his children becoming spoiled and shallow. But there are wealthy people who are kind and generous, just like there are poor people who are bitter and selfish. Money doesn't determine character. Choices do. His words echoed what Isabella had said earlier, and I realized that perhaps my fundamental assumption had been flawed from the beginning. I had treated wealth like a moral test that my children needed to pass before they could be trusted with it, when perhaps what they had needed was guidance in how to handle it responsibly. It's not too late, David said gently. They're adults now, but they're still your children. This doesn't have to be the end of your relationship. It could be the beginning of a more honest one. If they can forgive me, they will. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they will. Love doesn't disappear because of one mistake, even a big one. I hoped he was right, but as I looked at my children across the room, still together, still processing, still angry, I wasn't entirely sure. Some mistakes were too big to be easily forgiven, and some betrayals cut too deep to heal quickly. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversations and congratulations and carefully polite inquiries about my family's situation. Several guests made comments about how surprised they were to learn about my circumstances, while others seemed to have suspected all along that there was more to my story than met the eye. Marcus's parents, who had apparently been informed about the evening's revelations by their shell-shocked son, approached me near the end of the night with expressions that were difficult to read. Mrs. Vasquez, Marcus's mother began, her voice carefully neutral, we wanted to thank you for including us in such a significant family moment. Of course. I'm sorry it was so dramatic. That wasn't entirely intentional. We appreciate you sharing the truth with us, Marcus's father added. Though I have to admit, we're a bit concerned about Victoria. She seems quite upset. I looked across the room to where Victoria stood near the exit, clearly ready to leave but waiting for the evening to officially end. She had been avoiding eye contact with me for the past hour, and I could see the tension in every line of her body. She has every right to be upset, I said. This wasn't easy for any of them to hear. No, I imagine not. Marcus's mother paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. We hope you understand that this changes some things about the wedding planning, the budget discussions we've been having, the venue choices. Of course, Victoria should have whatever kind of wedding she wants. Money is no longer a consideration. And the prenuptial agreement? The question caught me off guard. I hadn't considered that Marcus's family might have been insisting on a prenup to protect their assets from my supposedly poor daughter. Now that they knew Victoria was independently wealthy, the dynamic of that conversation would shift dramatically. I think that's something for Victoria and Marcus to discuss, I said diplomatically. Yes, of course. It's just, this is quite a change in circumstances. I could hear the underlying concern in her voice. Marcus's family had been prepared to marry their son to a woman from a modest background, someone they could help and guide and perhaps patronize slightly. Now they were discovering that their future daughter-in-law was wealthier than they were, and that changed the power dynamic considerably. Change can be good, I said. Victoria will still be the same person she was yesterday. She'll just have more options now. Yes, Marcus's mother agreed, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. More options. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I found myself standing near the entrance, accepting final congratulations and farewells. My children had departed without saying goodbye, though Sebastian had nodded in my direction before following his sisters out the door. The hotel staff was beginning to clear tables and reset the ballroom for the next day's events, and Catherine was handling the logistics with her usual efficiency. Within an hour, all evidence of the evening would be gone except for the memories and the consequences. Mrs. Vasquez? A young woman approached me hesitantly. She looked familiar, but I couldn't place her immediately. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm Maria Santos. I work with Isabella at the marketing firm." "Oh yes, of course. Isabella mentions you often. I just wanted to say, what you did tonight was incredible. I mean, I'm sure it was difficult for your family, but the principle of it, teaching your children about values and character before wealth, it's really admirable." I appreciated her kindness, though I wasn't sure admirable was the right word for what I'd done. "Thank you, though I'm beginning to think I may have taken the lesson too far." "Maybe, but your children are amazing people. Isabella especially. She's hardworking and kind and genuine in a way that's rare. Whatever you taught them, it worked." Her words were a small comfort in what had otherwise been an emotionally devastating evening. Perhaps some good had come from my 18-year experiment, even if the revelation of it had caused so much pain. As I finally made my way to the elevator that would take me back to my hotel suite, I reflected on what David had said about this being the beginning of a more honest relationship with my children, rather than the end. I wanted to believe that was possible, but I also knew that trust, once broken, was not easily repaired. My phone buzzed with a text message as the elevator doors closed. It was from Isabella. "We need time to process this. Please don't call us for a while. We'll reach out when we're ready." I stared at the message, feeling the weight of those words. My children were asking for space, for time to understand what they'd learned, and decide how they wanted to move forward. It was a reasonable request, but it felt like another kind of punishment. In my hotel suite, I changed out of my elegant dress and into comfortable pajamas, removing the jewelry and makeup that had transformed me back into the woman I used to be. Looking at myself in the bathroom mirror, I could see both versions of myself reflected back: the wealthy widow I had always been, and the struggling mother I had pretended to be for 18 years. Tomorrow I would need to figure out how to integrate those two identities into something real and sustainable. I would need to learn how to be Elena Vasquez again, completely and honestly, without the elaborate deception that had defined my life for nearly 2 decades. But tonight I sat on the edge of my hotel bed and wondered if the price of that authenticity had been too high to pay. I had gained back my wealth, my status, and my true identity. In return, I had lost the trust and respect of the 3 people who mattered most to me in the world. It would remain to be seen whether that was a trade worth making. 3 weeks passed before I heard from any of my children. 3 weeks of living in my newly purchased penthouse apartment, surrounded by luxury I hadn't enjoyed in 18 years, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. The silence from Victoria, Sebastian, and Isabella was deafening, made worse by the fact that I checked my phone obsessively, hoping for any sign that they were ready to talk. The penthouse was everything I had dreamed of during those years in the studio apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, marble countertops in a kitchen large enough to host dinner parties, a master bedroom with a walk-in closet bigger than my old living room. I had hired an interior designer to furnish it with pieces that reflected both elegance and comfort, creating spaces that felt warm rather than cold, lived in rather than museum-like. But none of it mattered when I was experiencing it alone. I found myself eating breakfast at a dining table that seated 12, watching the sunrise through windows that cost more than most people's annual salaries, wondering if this was what Carlos had envisioned when he'd asked me to teach our children about money and values. The financial transition had been remarkably smooth. Marcus had helped me liquidate additional cryptocurrency holdings to purchase the penthouse outright, and my investment portfolio was now generating enough monthly income to support any lifestyle I chose. I had quit my job at the diner, much to Margaret's bewilderment, and was now officially living as the wealthy widow I had always been. But wealth without family felt hollow in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had spent 18 years sacrificing luxury for what I believed was a greater purpose. And now that I had both back, I realized that the purpose had been the more valuable of the two. My days fell into a routine that felt both familiar and strange. I would wake up in silk pajamas instead of worn cotton, make coffee with beans that cost $50 a pound instead of whatever was on sale at the grocery store, and spend my mornings reading financial reports and investment updates instead of getting ready for shifts at the diner. But the afternoons were the hardest. That was when I would normally have been working, serving coffee and sandwiches to customers who knew me as Elena the waitress, not Elena the millionaire. There had been a simplicity to that life, a clarity of purpose that I found myself missing despite its hardships. I tried to fill the time with activities that befitted my station. I hired a personal trainer and began working out in the penthouse's private gym. I scheduled appointments with a dermatologist and a nutritionist and a massage therapist, all the wellness services I hadn't been able to afford for 2 decades. I went shopping for clothes that fit my new lifestyle, building a wardrobe of designer pieces that made me look like the successful woman I had always been underneath. But every purchase, every appointment, every luxury felt tinged with sadness, because I had no one to share it with. I would buy a beautiful dress and have no family dinner to wear it to. I would have my hair professionally styled, and then sit alone in my apartment with no one to see it. I would prepare elaborate meals with ingredients from the finest markets and eat them by myself while looking out at a city full of people who had families that loved them. The isolation was made worse by the fact that I couldn't even talk to anyone about what I was going through. How do you explain to a therapist that you're depressed because you revealed to your children that you're incredibly wealthy? How do you tell a friend that your family is angry with you for lying about being poor? The problems of the rich, I was learning, were just as real as the problems of the poor, but they carried less sympathy from the world at large. I tried reaching out to David Chen, Carlos's old business partner, who had been so supportive at the party. We met for lunch at an upscale restaurant downtown, the kind of place where I now belonged but still felt like an imposter. "You look different," he said when I arrived, taking in my tailored blazer and professional styling. "More like the Elena I remember from 20 years ago." "I feel different too, though I'm not sure it's entirely in a good way." We ordered wine and appetizers, falling into the kind of conversation that Carlos and I used to have with him when we were all younger, and our biggest concerns were which investments to make and where to vacation. "Have you heard from the children?" he asked gently. "No. They asked for space, and I'm trying to respect that. But it's been 3 weeks, David. 3 weeks of complete silence. They're processing something enormous. You have to remember, their entire understanding of reality just shifted. That takes time. I keep wondering if I should have done it differently. Maybe told them privately, one at a time? Maybe eased them into it over months, instead of announcing it to a room full of people." David set down his wine glass and studied my face. "Elena, can I ask you something honestly?" "Of course. Do you regret it? Not the method, but the decision to tell them at all?" The question caught me off guard because I realized I hadn't really examined my feelings about the revelation itself, only about its aftermath. Did I regret finally telling my children the truth about our circumstances? "No," I said slowly. "I don't regret telling them. Living that lie was exhausting, and it was preventing us from having real relationships. I just regret how much it hurt them. But it would have hurt them whenever you told them. The hurt isn't about the timing or the method. It's about the fact that you kept There was no way to reveal 18 years of deception without causing pain. The dramatic announcement at the party had certainly made things worse, but even a quiet, private conversation would have shattered my children's trust. So what do I do now? How do I rebuild relationships with children who don't want to talk to me? You wait, and when they're ready, you listen. Really listen, without defending yourself or explaining your choices. You let them tell you how this affected them, and you accept responsibility for that impact. Even if I still believe I was trying to do the right thing, especially then, good intentions don't erase harmful consequences, Elena. The road to family dysfunction is paved with parents who thought they knew what was best for their children. His words stung because they forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding. Even after seeing my children's pain and anger, part of me still believed that my experiment had been worthwhile. I still thought that growing up with struggle had made them more compassionate, more hardworking, more grounded than they would have been with easy access to wealth. But David was suggesting that this belief itself was part of the problem, that my inability to fully accept responsibility for the harm I'd caused was preventing me from moving forward with my children. "I love them," I said quietly. Everything I did was because I love them. I know, but love without respect isn't enough. You have to respect their right to be angry, their right to make decisions about your relationship based on how your choices affected them, not on how much you love them. The conversation with David stayed with me for days afterward. I found myself examining my own motivations more critically, trying to understand not just what I had done but why I had continued doing it for so long. The truth was complicated and uncomfortable. Yes, I had initially hidden the money to honor Carlos's wishes and teach our children about values. But as the years went on, other factors had come into play. I had enjoyed the moral superiority of voluntary poverty, the sense that I was more virtuous than other wealthy people who lived ostentatiously. I had liked being seen as someone who had overcome adversity, who was making the best of difficult circumstances. There had been something addictive about the simplicity of that narrative. Elena, the struggling widow, was easier to understand than Elena, the wealthy woman who chose to live like she was poor. People knew how to relate to struggle. They didn't know how to relate to elaborate social experiments. But the most uncomfortable truth was that I had also enjoyed the control. For 18 years, I had been the orchestrator of my family's reality, the person who decided what was true and what was hidden, what my children needed to know, and what they didn't. Even when that control came at enormous personal cost, it had given me a sense of purpose and importance that I was reluctant to give up. Recognizing these motivations didn't make me feel better about my choices, but it did help me understand why my children's anger was so justified. I hadn't just lied to them about money. I had appointed myself the director of their lives without their knowledge or consent. It was during the 4th week of silence that I finally received a text message from Isabella. It was brief and formal. Can we meet for coffee? Just you and me. Tomorrow, at 2 p.m. at Grind on 5th Street. I stared at the message for several minutes, feeling a mixture of relief and terror. Relief that one of my children was finally ready to talk. Terror about what she might have to say. Isabella had always been the most analytical of my 3 children, the one most likely to have spent these weeks carefully examining every aspect of our situation. I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early, choosing a table in the back corner where we could talk privately. Grind was a small, independent place that Isabella had discovered during college, the kind of local business she supported because she believed in community over corporations. It was exactly the kind of place the old Elena would have chosen for its reasonable prices and cozy atmosphere. Isabella arrived exactly on time, looking professional in a navy blazer and dark jeans. She had always been the most put together of my children, even as a teenager, and now at 24 she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had figured out who she was and what she wanted. But I could see the strain around her eyes, the tension in her shoulders that suggested these past weeks had been as difficult for her as they had been for me. "Thank you for coming," she said as she sat down across from me. "Thank you for reaching out. I wasn't sure any of you would be ready to talk. Victoria and Sebastian aren't. They're still too angry. But I needed to understand some things before I could move forward." A waitress approached our table, and I realized with a start that it was someone I recognized from my neighborhood, a young woman who had served me coffee dozens of times when I was living paycheck to paycheck. She looked confused to see me in this context, clearly trying to reconcile the Elena she knew with the woman sitting across from someone in expensive clothes. "Elena? I thought you moved away. Haven't seen you at the old place in weeks." "Hi, Sarah. Yes, My circumstances changed recently." Sarah glanced around the upscale neighborhood we were in, then at my designer handbag and tailored coat. "Wow, congratulations. That's great news." After she took our order and left, Isabella watched me with curious eyes. "Does that happen a lot? Running into people from your old life?" "More than I expected. It's strange, having to explain the transition without explaining the whole story." "What do you tell them?" "That I came into some money recently." "Which is technically true." Isabella nodded slowly. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about. The technical truths and the actual lies and everything in between." She pulled out a small notebook, the kind she used for work projects. and I realized she had prepared for this conversation with the same methodical approach she brought to everything else. "I've been thinking about this situation from every angle I can imagine," she began. "And I need to understand the timeline, the decisions, the moments when you could have chosen differently. Okay. When Dad died, you were 37 years old with 3 children and approximately $8 million in assets. Is that correct?" The precision of her question surprised me. "How do you know the exact amount?" "I had Marcus run some calculations based on what you revealed at the party. If the current portfolio is worth $47 million and it's been growing for 18 years, the starting amount would have been around $8 million, depending on the investment mix." I was impressed despite myself. Isabella had clearly been doing her homework, approaching our family's financial situation with the same analytical skills she used in her marketing career. "Yes, that's approximately correct. So you are a young widow with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life, to send all 3 of us to college without debt, to provide us with opportunities that most families can only dream of. Yes. Instead, you chose to hide the money and let us believe we were struggling financially. You worked jobs you didn't need to work, lived in apartments you didn't need to live in, and allowed us to take on debt and worry about money that was unnecessary. I wanted you to learn. I'm not asking about your motivations yet. I'm establishing the facts." Her voice was calm but firm. "Is my understanding of the situation accurate?" "Yes." Isabella made a note in her notebook, and I realized she was treating this like a business meeting or a legal deposition. The formality was both impressive and heartbreaking. "When Sebastian turned 21, he gained access to his trust fund. But you didn't tell him about it. Instead, you let him continue believing we were poor, while he was secretly a millionaire. Is that correct? The trust was designed to be activated when you decided he was ready, which you never did." She looked up from her notebook. "Mom, Sebastian has been sending you money for 5 years. Money from his salary, money he earned at a job he took partly because he was worried about supporting you. He's been supporting his multimillionaire mother out of his own paycheck while sitting on a trust fund worth $14 million. Hearing it laid out so starkly was devastating. I had accepted Sebastian's financial help knowing it was completely unnecessary, knowing he had access to more money than he could spend in a lifetime. I thought it was building his character. No. Isabella's voice was sharp. It was testing him. You were testing all of us, to see if we would pass some moral examination you'd designed. And the criteria for passing were apparently so impossible to meet that none of us managed it in 18 years. Her words hit me like physical blows. She was right, of course. What I had framed as education had actually been evaluation, with standards that I had never clearly defined and apparently never intended to meet. When Victoria got engaged, Isabella continued. She was worried about the wedding budget because she believed her family couldn't contribute financially. She and Marcus had discussions about scaling back their plans, about having a smaller ceremony, about ways to manage costs that would be respectful of her poor mother's limitations. I never asked her to worry about that. But you knew she was worrying. You knew she was making decisions based on false information you had provided, and you let her continue making those decisions because it served your experiment. Isabella's composure was beginning to crack slightly, emotion seeping into her voice despite her obvious efforts to stay analytical. "And me," she continued. "I took out student loans for graduate school. I worked part-time jobs throughout college. I turned down opportunities to study abroad because I couldn't afford them. I made career decisions based on salary requirements because I thought I needed to be able to support myself and help support you." Each revelation was another knife in my chest. I had watched my youngest daughter struggle financially throughout her education, had seen her make sacrifices and compromises, had accepted her gratitude when I occasionally sent her small amounts of money for textbooks or groceries. "Isabella, I'm so sorry. I'm not finished." She looked down at her notebook again. "What I can't understand is the timeline. At what point were you planning to tell us? Because Sebastian is 30 now, and he still didn't know. Victoria is 28 and engaged, and she still didn't know. I'm 24 and building a career, and I still didn't know. I was waiting for the right time. No, you weren't. You were waiting for us to become the people you wanted us to be. You were waiting for us to prove that we deserved the truth. But the criteria kept changing, didn't it?" Every time we got close to meeting your standards, you found new reasons to continue the deception. Isabella closed her notebook and looked directly at me for the first time since she'd started talking. Mom, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about the money. This is about the fact that you made yourself the judge of our character, while we didn't even know we were being judged. I was trying to protect you. From what? From having choices? From having opportunities? From having the chance to learn about money and responsibility in a healthy way instead of through artificial scarcity? Her voice was rising now, the careful composure finally breaking down. Do you know what we learned from growing up poor? We learned to be ashamed of our circumstances. We learned to lie about our background, to fit in with people who had more money. We learned that poverty was something embarrassing that needed to be hidden or overcome. The irony of her words wasn't lost on me. In trying to teach my children not to be ashamed of poverty, I had inadvertently taught them exactly that lesson. We learned to measure our worth by our distance from where we came from, Isabella continued. We learned that having a struggling mother was something we needed to manage and compensate for. We learned exactly the opposite of what you intended to teach us. I see that now, I said quietly. I see how badly I miscalculated. Do you? Because I'm not sure you understand the scope of what you did. You didn't just lie about money, Mom. You created an entire false reality and then judged us for how we reacted to that reality. Isabella leaned back in her chair, looking exhausted. I spent years feeling guilty about my opportunities because I thought they came at your expense. I felt bad about going to graduate school because I thought it was a financial burden on our family. I felt bad about my job because it paid well while you were working at a diner. I never wanted you to feel guilty, but I did. We all did. We all carried the weight of thinking our success was somehow selfish because our mother was struggling. The pain in her voice was unbearable. I had spent 18 years trying to teach my children about character and values, and instead I had taught them to feel guilty about their own achievements. And now, Isabella said, her voice becoming steady again, now we have to figure out how to live with the knowledge that all of that guilt was unnecessary, that all of those years of worry and sacrifice and careful budgeting were based on a lie you chose to maintain. What can I do? I asked. How do I make this right? Isabella was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. I don't know if you can make it right. Some things can't be undone, but if you want to try to move forward, you have to start by accepting full responsibility for the harm you caused. I do accept responsibility. No, you don't. You keep explaining your motivations, defending your intentions, trying to make us understand why you did what you did. But your reasons don't matter right now. What matters is the impact. She pulled out her phone and showed me a text message thread between her and her siblings. I could see fragments of conversations about trust, about anger, about not knowing how to process what they'd learned. Victoria isn't speaking to anyone right now. She's taking time off work, canceling wedding planning meetings, basically hiding from the world while she tries to figure out who she is if not the daughter of a struggling single mother. And Sebastian is angry, in a way I've never seen before. He feels like the biggest fool in the world for worrying about you financially while you were richer than all of his clients combined. Isabella put her phone away and looked at me with an expression that was both sad and determined. We're all going to therapy, Mom, separately and together. We need help processing this. That's good. That's smart. We've also decided that we need boundaries with you while we figure this out. My heart sank. What kind of boundaries? No contact for the next 2 months. No calls, no texts, no surprise visits. We need space to work through our feelings without having to manage yours at the same time. Isabella, this isn't punishment, Mom. This is self-preservation. We can't heal from this while we're still in crisis mode with you. The finality in her voice was devastating, but I could see the logic in what she was saying. My children needed time and space to process their emotions without having to worry about mine. After 2 months, I asked. After 2 months, we'll reevaluate. Maybe we'll be ready for family therapy together. Maybe we'll need more time. I can't promise you anything beyond that. Isabella gathered her things and prepared to leave, but then she paused and looked at me one more time. Mom, I need you to understand something. We're not angry because you have money. We're angry because you lied to us for 18 years about something fundamental to our lives. We're angry because you made decisions about our reality without our consent. And we're angry because even now, you seem more concerned with being understood than with understanding us." With that, she stood and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving me alone with my cold coffee and the devastating clarity of everything she'd said. The next 2 months were the longest of my life. I honored the boundaries my children had set, resisting the urge to call or text even when I saw social media posts that made me worry about their well-being. Instead, I threw myself into trying to understand what had gone wrong and how I could do better. I started seeing a therapist of my own, Dr. Patricia Huang, who specialized in family dynamics and communication. Our first session was difficult because I found myself still trying to justify my choices, still explaining my good intentions and the lessons I'd hoped to teach. "Elena," Dr. Huang said gently after listening to my story, "what do you think your children needed from you as they were growing up?" "Values, character, understanding about what really matters in life. Those are things you wanted to give them. What did they need to receive?" The distinction between giving and receiving hadn't occurred to me before. I had been so focused on what I thought my children should learn that I hadn't considered what they actually needed to feel loved and supported. "Security," I said slowly. "Honesty, trust. And how do you think growing up with artificial financial stress affected their sense of security?" The question forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding. My children hadn't grown up feeling secure. They'd grown up feeling anxious about money, worried about their family's stability, uncertain about their future opportunities. I made them less secure, not more. And the dishonesty? How do you think 18 years of deception affected their ability to trust? It destroyed it. Our sessions continued weekly, with Dr. Huang helping me understand the difference between impact and intention. I began to see how my children's experience of growing up with a mother who lied about fundamental aspects of their reality had shaped their understanding of truth, trust, and family relationships. I also began to understand something else. My own need for control had been driven by my fear of losing them. After Carlos died, I had been terrified of making mistakes that might damage my children, so I had tried to control every variable in their lives. But that control had ultimately driven them away more effectively than any mistake could have. During this time, I also began exploring ways to use my wealth more meaningfully. I researched charitable organizations focused on financial literacy education, looking for ways to help other families navigate conversations about money and values in healthier ways than I had. I donated anonymously to a scholarship fund at the high school my children had attended, specifically for students who showed character and work ethic regardless of their family's financial circumstances. I funded a program that taught young people about investing and financial planning, hoping to help them avoid the kind of confusion about money that had plagued my own family. But even these philanthropic efforts felt hollow when I was estranged from my own children. What good was wealth if it couldn't buy back the relationships that mattered most? The 2 months passed slowly, marked by holidays I spent alone and birthdays I couldn't acknowledge. When the deadline finally arrived, I waited anxiously for some kind of communication from my children. It came in the form of a text from Sebastian. "We're ready to try family therapy. We found a counselor who specializes in family trust issues. Her name is Dr. Miranda Torres. First session is next Tuesday at 3 p.m. Will you come?" I responded immediately. "Yes. Thank you for this chance." The family therapy session was held in a comfortable office with soft lighting and tissue boxes strategically placed around the room. Dr. Torres was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a calm demeanor that immediately put me at ease. My 3 children sat together on one side of the room, presenting a united front that was both reassuring and intimidating. They had clearly been supporting each other through this process, healing together in ways that didn't include me. "Elena," Dr. Torres began, "your children have spent several sessions helping me understand the situation from their perspective. Today, I'd like to hear from you about what you've learned during these past 2 months." I had prepared for this question, but actually articulating my thoughts in front of my children was more difficult than I'd expected. "I've learned that good intentions don't excuse harmful actions," I said carefully. "I've learned that trying to control my children's reality was a form of betrayal, even though I thought I was protecting them. and I've learned that my fear of losing them actually caused me to lose them. Victoria spoke for the first time since I'd entered the room. What specifically have you learned about how your choices affected us? I've learned that you grew up feeling insecure about money instead of secure in your family's love. I've learned that you developed shame about our circumstances instead of pride in your character. I've learned that you felt guilty about your own success because you thought it came at my expense. Sebastian leaned forward slightly. And what have you learned about trust? I've learned that trust isn't just about telling the truth. It's about respecting someone's right to make informed decisions about their own life. I violated that trust by making decisions about your reality without your knowledge or consent. Isabella nodded slowly. Those are the right words, Mom. But understanding intellectually and changing emotionally are different things. How do we know you won't try to control our lives in other ways? It was a fair question, and one I'd been wrestling with in therapy. I don't know how to prove that except through my actions over time. I can't undo what I did, but I can commit to being completely honest with you going forward. Even when you think the truth might hurt us? Victoria asked. Especially then. I've learned that protecting you from difficult truths doesn't actually protect you at all. Dr. Torres guided us through several more exchanges, helping us articulate feelings and establish ground rules for moving forward. The session was emotionally exhausting but also hopeful. For the first time in months, I was in the same room as my children, talking honestly about what had happened between us. At the end of the session, Dr. Torres assigned us homework. We were each to write a letter to the others about what we needed for the relationship to heal and what we were willing to offer in return. Over the following weeks, our family therapy sessions became a regular ritual. Slowly, carefully, we began to rebuild trust and understanding. My children shared how my deception had affected their relationships with money, with each other, and with the concept of family itself. I shared my own journey of understanding how control and fear had driven me to make choices that ultimately hurt the people I loved most. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick. There were sessions where old anger flared up, where someone walked out, where progress felt impossible. But gradually, we began to find our way back to each other. 6 months after that first family therapy session, Victoria asked me to help plan her wedding. Not the modest ceremony she'd been planning when she thought money was tight, but the celebration she actually wanted. It was a small gesture, but it felt enormous. "I want you to walk me down the aisle," she said during one of our sessions. "Dad can't do it, and you're the parent I have left. But I need to know that you're there as my mother, not as someone trying to teach me a lesson. I'll be there as your mother, I promised. Just your mother." Sebastian took longer to trust me again, but eventually he asked for my help with something he'd been passionate about for years. Starting a nonprofit organization focused on financial literacy for young adults. Using my resources and his expertise, we created a foundation that taught college students and young professionals about investing, budgeting, and making informed financial decisions. "I want to help other people avoid the confusion I grew up with," he told me, "but I want to do it honestly, not through manipulation or artificial scarcity." Isabella, meanwhile, decided to write a book about our experience. She wanted to explore the psychology of family secrets, the impact of well-intentioned deception, and the long process of rebuilding trust after betrayal. "I think there are other families struggling with similar issues," she explained. "Maybe not exactly the same situation, but the same underlying problems with communication and control and trust." A year after the family therapy began, we had our first family dinner in my penthouse. It was strange to see my children in the space I'd created with my revealed wealth, but it was also wonderful to have them back in my life. "You know," Victoria said as we lingered over dessert, "I never thanked you for the trust fund. You don't need to thank me, it was always yours." "No, I do need to thank you. Because even though I'm still angry about how long it took to learn about it, I'm grateful that Dad planned for our future, and that you protected his investment all these years." Sebastian nodded. "I've been thinking about that too. You could have spent everything after Dad died. You could have justified it as taking care of your children. Instead, you made our inheritance grow." "I also prevented you from accessing it for years," I pointed out. "Yeah, you did, and that was wrong." But the intention to preserve our inheritance wasn't wrong. Isabella raised her wine glass to complicated families and imperfect parents and the long road back to trust. We all raised our glasses, and for the first time in over a year, I felt like I was truly with my children, rather than performing for them or teaching them or trying to control them. I love you, I said. I've always loved you, and I'm sorry it took me so long to learn how to show that love without conditions. We love you too, Mom, Victoria said, even when we don't like you very much. Especially then, Sebastian added with a small smile. As my children prepared to leave that evening, Isabella lingered behind to help me clear the dishes. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. Are you happy? I mean, really happy, living like this? She gestured around the penthouse with its expensive furnishings and city views. I considered the question seriously. I'm happier than I was when I was living a lie. But I'm not sure happiness comes from the money or the apartment. I think it comes from being honest with the people I love. Good answer. Isabella? Yeah? Thank you for being brave enough to have that first conversation with me. I don't think we would have found our way back without it. She smiled, and for a moment I saw the little girl she used to be before everything got so complicated. We're stubborn people, Mom. We would have figured it out eventually. As I watched my children leave that night, I reflected on everything that had brought us to this point. The 18 years of deception, the dramatic revelation, the months of estrangement, the slow process of rebuilding trust. It had been the most expensive education of my life, costing me relationships that were worth more than any amount of money. But it had also taught me something invaluable. That authentic love requires authentic communication, that trust can't be rebuilt without complete honesty, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is give up control and let the people you care about make their own choices. I was Elena Vasquez, a wealthy widow who had learned too late that the most important inheritance you can give your children isn't money at all. It's the security of knowing that they are loved unconditionally, trusted completely, and respected as the individuals they are rather than the people you think they should become. The money was still there, growing quietly in accounts around the world. But now it served its proper purpose, providing security and opportunities for my family, rather than serving as a tool for manipulation and control. My children knew who they were now. Not the poor kids who had overcome adversity, but the wealthy young adults who had learned valuable lessons about work, character, and empathy through their mother's complicated choices. They were using their resources thoughtfully, building careers they were passionate about, and maintaining the values that had always mattered more than the money itself. And I was finally living honestly, surrounded by beauty but grounded by authenticity, wealthy in ways that had nothing to do with my bank account and everything to do with the relationships I had almost lost and then fought to rebuild. It had taken me 57 years to learn that the best revenge against the world's cruelty isn't financial success. It's a life lived with integrity, surrounded by people who love you for who you really are. And that lesson, more than any amount of offshore wealth, was the real treasure I would carry forward for the rest of my life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.